Welcome to the Confident Retirement Podcast. Is doing the most important things alone a good idea? How comfy are you with your choices when it comes to life's biggest decisions? What is real peace of mind with financial confidence, and how can you get it? Chris Fleming and Mark Peachy are the founders of LPF Advisors in Sarasota, Florida. On the show, they bring together the best and brightest minds to share with you how to have a more confident financial picture. They empower listeners with simple, common sense and financial wisdom. And now, here are your hosts from LPF Advisors.
Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the Confident Retirement Podcast, brought to you by LPF Advisors. I'm your host here, as always, Chris Fleming. And today I have the honor of welcoming Katherine Miller to the show. Her family law firm believes in using collaboration and conversation to reach the results that are fair for all parties. They meet clients at the intersection where law meets everyday people, with an emphasis on protecting the interests of the children when they're involved. Katherine, thanks for being with me today and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Chris.
Yeah, we're going to have some fun. So you have kind of an interesting background story. I was doing some research on you and how you came to be where you are. So why don't you take me through that for the listeners, how you found your career or your practice?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So I went to law school because I was interested in justice. And I figured out in the orientation week that was not what law school was going to be about, but I didn't have a plan B. Mm-hmm. I come from a family of therapists, and I've always been really interested in people, but I thought I was too bossy to be a therapist. It turns out that there are bossy therapists, but I didn't know that then. So anyway, I decided to stick it out in law school and focus my career on that intersection of the law where it meets people in their personal lives. And so I got a job shortly after law school in a family law firm. Mm-hmm. And we were doing about half matrimonial work, so divorce work, mm-hmm. and half child welfare litigation. And it meant that we were in court, and I was in court a lot. And in fact, fun fact, I tried many cases in front of Judge Judy when she was actually sitting on the bench in the New York City Family Court, just to give you a sense of the tenor of what those court cases were like, right? Can you imagine?
Okay. Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so after a couple of years, I thought, wow, there's got to be a better way to help people resolve conflict where in situations where relationships really matter. And I took a mediation training, and I started to try to integrate those sort of mediative ideas of settling and having negotiations about settlement based on the criteria that were important to the people and the families, not so much necessarily what was important to a judge in a black robe. And I started to try to integrate those ideas into my negotiations. And that's mostly in the divorce world, not so much in the child welfare world, which is much more regulated by government entities. Mm-hmm. And in every one of those cases, Chris, I ran into the same problem. And that problem was the other lawyer. And it wasn't that they were bad lawyers or bad people or trying to get in the way. We just couldn't get on the same page about the criteria that we were going to use to help our clients have these conversations, difficult conversations. And so I struggled with that for about 10 years. And then I got divorced myself. And when I was sitting in the client chair, I realized in a very personal way what I had always thought was true, which is that divorce is horribly disorienting, incredibly anxiety-provoking, really scary, expensive, and definitely not on the time frame you, the client, I would want it to be. And so when I was done with that experience, and my husband and I were able to settle in a very collaborative way, even though we had a pretty high conflict situation. We weren't able to mediate, but we did resolve it in a conference room. We never went to court with the help of our attorneys and just kind of get through it in a pretty civilized way. But after that experience, I thought, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I don't think I can be a lawyer anymore. And, maybe not the smartest thing to decide. There are a lot of other areas of law besides family law I could have thought about, but I'm like, nope, I'm done.
Right.
And I took another mediation training. I quit my job, and I looked around for something else to do with my life. And then a friend of mine said, why don't you come take this collaborative law training? And I was like, how could this really be any different? Same problem, 10 years, same problem every case, right? The other lawyers, just a bunch of lawyers sitting around talking, and we're never going to get on the same page. And she said, I think that you should come. It's really different. And I did. And I had nothing better to do. So I went, I took this training, and within 15 minutes, it was a collaborative divorce training. And within 15 minutes, I felt, Chris, that I had come home. Like this was the way that I'd always been trying to practice, where the lawyers, and now in the collaborative process, it's an interdisciplinary team, is trying to find a way to help these people resolve the issues that they need to resolve in order to separate and become a sort of a binuclear family. And so I got really excited about it, and I decided that that's how I wanted to focus my career. And we're not always able to do it in the collaborative process. Sometimes it's in mediation, sometimes it's in negotiation, and frankly, sometimes it's in litigation. But that we try to keep, and I founded my law firm on this idea that we're really trying to keep what's important to the people in the forefront of our conversations. And the law is not irrelevant. It absolutely isn't irrelevant, but it doesn't necessarily drive the conversation every time.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the thing.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious then, and this is speaking maybe from the business of running a law practice. Is there something that you wish you knew now or something you wish you knew then that you know now? If you could go back in time and give that younger you some advice.
Well, this is a slightly different subject, but I wish I knew that the business of law is a business like every other business. And that you have to think about it like that. And sometimes lawyers, and this is fairly traditional in the bar, think of ourselves as being special flowers, right? We have a practice,
right?
We have these, ethical duties, and we do, but that it's still a business, and you really need to think about it that way. And if you do, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because it allows us then to help more people be just more straight about it and adapt business techniques that are really helpful to the efficiencies of providing legal services.
Yeah. Well, I think about if your own house is in order from a business standpoint, then you don't have those stresses and anxieties, and you can focus on what you really are good at and like to do, which is what you just described, in helping people.
That's exactly right.
So
it also allows us to be, if a lawyer is really worried about money, right, like making money herself or paying their employees, and doesn't have that stuff kind of working, then that's the thing that I think clients or potential clients worry about, is that lawyers are going to take advantage of them. That their interests are not aligned with the client's interests. The longer this goes on, the more it's going to cost me, the more money my lawyer is going to make. And if you really have an efficiently run business, then as the lawyer, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, you're eliminating as much as you can, or mitigating the conflicts of interest where you can just focus on them. Exactly. There's some carryover in our industry there too as well. So maybe describe what you consider to be an ideal client for your practice.
Sure. I think an ideal client for us is someone who is obviously, understandably, upset by the fact that they're going through a divorce, whether or not they chose it or not, because I chose to get divorced, and I still think it's not something that I got married the first time thinking I was going to do, right?
Right. No one does.
But really is willing to engage in it and not just feel like a victim of it, right? Who, for many people, it's, the divorce is, the way that I think of it, the intersection between what was and what will be. And it's a real opportunity to take stake of your life and rethink your priorities and your goals and where you want to go. And actually, oftentimes in this sort of divorce time, which often happens in midlife, it's a real reset on your goals and what's most important. And things have changed from the time you were in college, you graduate from college or graduate school, and you're thinking, well, this is what I think is really important. 10 years later, 15 years later, 20, 30 years later, you know what? You've learned a lot about life. And so our best clients are people who are like, wow, here I am. What do I really want to accomplish in the rest of my life? What's most important to me? And really think and work that through. Those are the people that we like to work with the most.
Okay. And I'm sure there are some misconceptions that people have about the process or what you can accomplish for them or, get done. So are there some common ones that you run across?
Well, I think there's a lack of education,
Hmm.
right? And so it's kind of the flip side of the coin there. So I'd rather answer it that way if that's okay
Sure.
with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people think that their ideas of divorce are driven by the media.
Hmm.
And so they don't really understand, and it's important to understand that there are a lot of choices about how you get divorced that you make at the beginning of the
Hmm.
process, and you make them one way or the other. So you can either make them intentionally or you
Right.
make them by default,
By default.
by not choosing something else.
Mm.
And so I think that it's the idea that it has to be the War of the Roses or Kramer versus Kramer or anything like that is
Yeah.
just, is not true. And so I think that, first of all, in across the country, 95% of divorces settle before a judge makes a decision after a trial.
Hmm.
95%. Those are pretty high statistics.
Yeah.
And what that means is that people are signing an agreement, settling all of the issues without having somebody else tell them what to do, right? The
Mm-hmm.
judge or a jury in some circumstances, but usually it's just a judge. And
Hmm.
so once you realize that you're overwhelmingly likely to make your own decisions with the support of counsel, with the support of your attorney, and maybe with your therapist and or coach or financial advisor, but you're going to be making those decisions and signing a contract that resolves all the issues. Once you realize that, then it's really not a matter of whether or not you're going to, it's how you're going to. And so thinking through the options of mediation, collaborative law, negotiation without going to court, and what the pros and cons
Mm.
of just going into court and starting an action and involving a judge without thinking through the consequences. I think in certain circumstances, it absolutely makes sense to do that. But I think a
Hmm.
lot of people find themselves in a courtroom without having really realized what the consequences of that were going to be. So that's something I think I wish
Yeah.
people knew early on in the process.
There's always trade-offs. So there's always, you're trading one thing for another in some way or another. So you want to, and that's, I guess, the education piece where I'm sure people come in and say, well, I've read all about what's going to go on the internet. And I've just come in to ask you a couple questions and, I want you to
Sure.
be on my side, but this is how I want it to go. I know that I run into that sometimes with people that I meet first time. So I know there's a lot of things that clients can't control. So what happens like in divorce proceedings or the process that kind of makes it so lengthy and emotionally taxing? Is it the lack of education or is it that people have unfounded expectations of how they think it should go? What's your opinion on that? I know that's kind of a more what's your opinion question, but
Well, divorce is very complicated.
Mhm.
I think of the issues as being like a knitting basket that a kitten got into and, played with all
Right.
that yarn, right? So
Right.
that the yellow yarn, the blue yarn, the red yarn, the green yarn, it's all like tangled up together. So when you start to try to pull out the yellow yarn, the red and the blue and the green all come with it and
Right.
it's all tangled up together. And I think that's why it's so hard because
Hmm.
marriage is such a complex relationship, right? It's a business partnership, it's a intimate partnership, it's a friendship, it's a parenting alignment, it's a physical relationship. There's so many things that go into it that when you start to try to untangle it
Mm.
and rewind those different yarns into their own skeins, I'm not a knitter, but I think that's the word.
We'll
uh,
go with it.
right, then it's really hard to do because it's so entwined like that.
Mm.
And another thing is that when marriages or any relationship starts to maybe stop working particularly well, people feel this paradigm of right and wrong, right?
Hmm.
So, and they get into a conflict dynamic. So they're constantly feeling wronged by the other
Mm.
person and misunderstood. And then they develop a series of conflict dynamics that really don't work very well. For
Hmm.
example, I know I have a couple of conflict conversations with my husband where he says something, I say something, he says something, and I know I have like right in the tip of my tongue and the front of my brain the thing that I want to say. And Chris, I am so freaking right. You have no idea how right I am. You would agree I was right. Your entire family would agree. The universe agrees that I'm right. But I also know that if I say that thing, that I'm so right, that I could literally script out everything that he and I are going to say for the next 20 minutes, and that we are going to both walk away from that conversation frustrated and unhappy. And, that over time devolves, and people just get into a feeling of feeling so insulted, betrayed, unheard, unappreciated, unseen by the other person, that when they get into the negotiation, it feels like that person is so wrong. They've done this to me and this to me and that to me. And I've been so good in this way, that way, and the other way, and blah, 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 blah. And so that dynamic is really obviously unhelpful to the marriage, and a difficult thing in the divorce as well. Yeah. So if we can calm that down, when I work as a mediator, and I say to the couples, what, if you've been in marriage counseling, my job is a lot easier than that person's job, because as a mediator, I just need to help you find a way to come apart in a civil way, not stay together where you're going to be constantly in each other's faces about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you said that. And I'm sure some of that carries over into the mediations and what they're willing to agree to and those types of things. When they have that hurt and that resentment that carries over, that's tough. People are people. Yeah. So that kind of leads into what usually are people's biggest fears or concerns. So I'm sure they come in and say, well, I don't care about this, and that, or how that goes, or how this goes. I just want A or B or C to go my way. So are those common among the people that you work with?
Sure. I think that's common for everybody, because you face something like divorce in your life and you think, you know what, this stinks, right? I'm really worried about this, but I could be okay so long as, something, right? So one of the things is, so long as my kids are okay. Right? And my kids are okay often translates to so long as we don't have to move. Right?
Okay.
So, that we're creating some security. Another one is, and let me just say, the statistics on the children of divorce is that they're overwhelmingly okay. That they go through a period of sadness and difficulty around the divorce itself, and then they rally, and that they're resilient. And so long as their parents aren't fighting all the time, and the statistics also show that high conflict between parents, divorced or together, is a bad indicator of future success of children. And so if you can keep the conflict in front of your children down, then your kids are likely to be okay, regardless of the outcome of the divorce. So it's something for your listeners to know, that just because you're getting divorced doesn't mean your kids are going to have bigger challenges than any other kid, or a kid whose parents didn't get divorced. Another thing that comes up a lot is security and financial security, right? And so imagine a situation, and this happens a lot, where a couple has planned for retirement or old age, and they're thinking, all right, well, we're going to be working together with the economies of scale. So together we're going to live in this place, and together we're going to drive this car, and together we're going to go on these vacations and all that stuff. And now we're going to divide those assets, and each of us is going to have probably half of what we had, together. And we're losing the economies of scale. And so we're going to have separate houses and separate vacations and separate cars and all, separate refrigerators. And so that is a big fear. And frankly, it's a realistic thing to consider, because, a lot of people say, well, I'm going to work really hard for this many years. And according to my plan, if I work really hard for this many years, I'll be able to create this much in assets and this much in my retirement account, whatever. And then I can retire, right? I can work less. I can, do whatever. And sometimes the reality of the situation is that people have to work longer than they might otherwise have had to, in order to replace the financial security that they had as a couple.
Okay. Thank you for taking us through that. And I'm also, you kind of touched on this, but it seems to me you're very passionate about the outcomes for the children and for the kids. And I know that the parents can sometimes use them, whether you call it a bargaining chip, or they can use them as leverage. So I'm sure that happens more than you'd like. So how do you help people work through that, or how do you help them see the way on that where they can hopefully not do that and do what is really in the best interest of the kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think there's two things about that. One is what the parents are doing intentionally, and then what's happening unintentionally. And I think when people are in litigation, it's almost impossible not to have that impact your kids. So it's almost impossible in the negotiation not to use the children or the parenting plan or custody as part of the legal battle. And that whether or not it's really an issue or not really an issue, it's going to be it's often an apparent issue just in order to put pressure on the rest of the situation, because where the kids live have financial implications. Whether or not, if you're in a negotiation with someone and you ask them for something that they're terribly afraid of losing, they're going to make concessions on things you particularly want. And that's a shame that the children have to get involved in that way or be involved in that way. They're often assigned an attorney of their own, or there's a forensic evaluation of the parents and that involves interviews of the children. They are kind of pulled into the divorce very explicitly and very clearly, when obviously that's not a wonderful thing for kids. But there's another thing about that, is that when the divorce is really high conflict and it's scary, and the divorce process itself is very hijacking and disorienting from the parents, it's really hard for those parents to show up in the best way they possibly can for their children. So they're focused on depositions and going to court and motions and the fear and the expense and all of that can take 2 years. I mean, sometimes it takes years and years and years to get all the way through that. How can they really also show up for their kids, even separately, and fully and emotionally in the way the kids really deserve to have done? So when we're working outside the court system, we really try to bring down that anxiety. And of course, there are big decisions to be made, Chris, and I'm not trying to poo-poo that. There are big decisions to be made, and there's a lot to think of, and it does create anxiety, but we can do it in a time frame and in a way that is more supportive of the parties as they go through it, and so that the people can be more available for their children, and we can bring in parenting coaches and help them figure out how they're going to parent from separate households or parent separately. One thing that comes up in marriages all the time, and I'm sure you've talked to people about this, is that just because the parents are married to each other and living together doesn't mean they agree on parenting.
Right.
One of the things that comes up all the time. One
Absolutely.
person is more of a disciplinarian, another person is more forgiving, or one person is more safety conscious, and the other person is a little bit more lackadaisical. So these are like conflicts that people don't really talk about often before it's an issue. We should ground our 10-year-old. What are you talking about? Grounding is the worst thing we could possibly do. And I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just saying there's conflict. So when you're living separately and you don't love each other anymore, it's really easy just to start shaking your finger at the other person and saying, you are so wrong-headed. So that's ways in which we can really try to keep the children out of it and consider their needs without yanking them into the process.
Yeah, that's well said. And I'm smiling because my wife and I went through marriage counseling before we got married, and parenting styles was not a topic. But what I found to be able to do with my kids now, when they come to me with a question and I'm suspect, I always ask them, well, did you ask your mother this? And what did she say?
Yes, that's very wise.
And then I respond accordingly from there. Maybe I need to talk to her before I get back to you. Okay, so we've been discussing conflict is kind of a vein that's run through our conversation. And you're involved with this Center for Understanding Conflict. I think you're either the acting director or you're a big part of that. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that and its importance for you?
The Center for Understanding and Conflict is an organization, and we teach the understanding-based model of conflict resolution. And this changed my life when I was introduced to this. It was right after I quit my job that I talked about earlier. Yeah. I took another mediation training with the center, and it was up until that time, when I got into a dispute with somebody or conflict, I was just like, I'm just going to tell you how right I am, right?
Right.
And I'm just like, you're wrong. And
Right.
and the space for you and my conflict with you is just like shrink, 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 shrink,
Yeah.
shrink, shrink, right?
Right.
Where I would just be like, disregard you. And then after a while, I can just like swat you away.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Why aren't you agreeing with me? Everyone should, if everything would be better if they would just think
Yes,
like me and do what I say. Right.
because I'm right.
Right. Of
Yeah,
course.
you idiot. Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, simply put, the understanding-based model basically says that the first step in resolving a conflict isn't for one person to try to put down the other. It's for both people to try to understand where everybody's coming from and what the outside information is. So you come into a conflict, I'm in a conflict with you. And, the first thing I need to understand is me. Right? Like, why am I so upset by you? Why am I so upset by what's going on? What is it that's at stake for me? What's most important? And I also really need to understand the outside circumstances that might be impacting us. So in a divorce, what's the house worth? What's the mortgage? What's in our retirement account? How do we spend our money? And a lot of people don't know how they spend their money.
Right.
They just do, right?
Yeah.
And so the knowledge is power, and it's not about judgment. It's not like what you spend too much money on clothes or vacation or beauty or cars or watches. It's not about judging that. It's just about knowing what it is, right? And then I have the opportunity to really understand from you what's important to you and why, without it being a right-wrong dynamic, right? I'm just hearing you. And that just in and of itself, that enhanced understanding relaxes the dynamic and it shifts it a little and when it shifts that little bit, resolution is possible where before it seemed impossible. And just having that conversation and not allowing ourselves, and this is really difficult when you're actually engaged in the conflict yourself. And that's why mediators and lawyers, conflict professionals can be really helpful to help you disentangle from that conflict trap we talked about earlier and see that shift and see those opportunities that didn't appear. Oh, you feel that's really important to you? I never knew that. Well, that's really important to me too. So let's see if we can work on that thing that all of a sudden, because now we've shifted the conflict a little, we can see in each other where we never saw it before.
Okay. And is that probably the one, because I was thinking I would ask you the one piece of advice that you would give to listeners in resolving conflict in their own lives. Do you think that's what it would be, is the understanding of where the other person's coming from and the gaining of that information?
Yes, and though, let me add to that, if I may. I think it's really important for each of us to understand ourselves first. Okay. Right? Because otherwise it feels like, well, wait a second, I'm now putting myself aside in order to understand you. And I'm not saying that.
Right.
What I'm saying is, sometimes I have these conversations with myself when I'm driving by myself. I'll be like upset about something or anxious with something, and I'll say out loud to myself, Katherine, what's up with that? What's up with you about that? Right. And then answer that question out loud for myself, because it just processes in a different way. So if you can understand, like, what's up with that? What's that triggering? Because the thing is that each of us come into relationship with each other with our own history, our own trauma, our own triggers, and inadvertently we're triggering each other or activating each other's defensive fight, fright, freeze, mechanisms. And we go into this place and now we're all like upset. And if you can really understand what it is that's happening for yourself and why, that's a really important thing to understand. And also what your priorities are, so that, picking your battles, like in terms of what it really matters and what is just like, you're just, arguing to argue about.
Right.
And then you think, all right, well, I'm thinking about you. What would cause, one thing that I find is really helpful is, I think, if I were saying the things that Chris is saying, why would I be saying that? Right? What would I be thinking about me that would cause me to think that? And then you'll be like, oh, well, that makes sense. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Maybe I would never do that. Again, it's not about me, it's about you. And we can try to understand a little bit what's going on with the other person. And if you're not, deeply into it, to approach that other person, especially someone you love, with a hypothesis of generosity, that you're coming from a good place. I love you. You're, and that's where you're coming from. You're not trying to attack me. And if you are attacking me, it's because you feel attacked. It's likely because you feel attacked by me.
You're in the defense.
And right. And if you can have that sense of generosity for each other, I think that makes the conversation a lot easier. And I'm not saying that people should stuff it. I think it does make it for an easier conversation, that's more helpful and gets you somewhere.
Right. Yeah, that's the hard work.
Exactly.
Right. Well, God knows we have enough conflict going on as it is.
For sure.
If people could slow down and work on themselves, that would be fantastic. Okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit. I want to ask you, from a business standpoint, what do you kind of see as your biggest opportunity for the practice going forward?
Yeah, I think that, it's an interesting thing, but I have found since the big recession, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, people have been wanting to focus their resources on results rather than on just useless fighting.
Okay.
And post-pandemic, I think that people are again reminded of the importance of finding resolutions that make sense for them. And so, I think during the pandemic, people whose marriages were not good, but not terrible, kind of white knuckled it through that difficult time, right?
Yeah.
But now as we come out of the pandemic and people are thinking, you know what, maybe now is the time for us to go our separate ways, but they want to do it in a thoughtful way, in a way that feels as safe as possible, because we've all, of course, been threatened. So I think that one of the biggest opportunity for my firm and for people who work like us, focusing on what's most important for the people and trying to keep them out of court if at all possible, to come up with a human solution. Because when people are getting divorced, Chris, they have a people problem with a legal consequence. And you walk into a lot of lawyers' office, they're going to be like, oh, legal problem, people consequence. And that's really not going to be particularly helpful. So I think it's about education and for people to learn that they don't have to do it that way. They can approach the divorce as a people problem and let the lawyers make it work.
Yeah, the legal side of it. Okay, well, maybe on the flip side of that, Katherine, what do you maybe a big challenge or an obstacle for the practice that you hope to overcome?
Yeah, it's that education that people get scared. They feel like they need protection and that they have this idea that the court is going to be able to protect them. And while it's true that the court does offer certain protections or certain powers, a lot of times you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And that if you can figure out a way to negotiate this in a civilized way, you're actually going to do better. And another thing that I think is this sort of misunderstanding that taking the high road is a weakness and makes you vulnerable, where I actually think that taking the high road makes you powerful and makes you strong and gets you a better result. And so it's that misunderstanding and that sort of emotional fearful reaction. I need to protect myself, and that means I need to lawyer up, and I think you should see a lawyer. I mean, I'm not saying that, but I need to be aggressive, and that being aggressive is the best way to defend yourself when actually I think it's not.
Okay. I like that. And if people want to learn more about you or your firm, contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. You can find us on the internet. The website is www.miller-law.com. And I also have a podcast, Chris, where we've interviewed a lot of experts in the divorce world over the years, and that can be found at divorcedialogues.com.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Katherine, I want to thank you for being here today. This was a true pleasure. I really enjoyed interviewing you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.
Yeah. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Confident Retirement Podcast, for listening and watching, brought to you by LPF Advisors, where we're hoping to bring the confidence of everyday people to another level, one show at a time. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, listening. Be well. Take care. Katherine, thanks again.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Confident Retirement Podcast with Chris and Mark from LPF Advisors. For more information on them and retiring confidently, please visit lpfadvisors.com. If your ears are pleased and your mind is now at ease, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.